Hello, and welcome to YNPN Orlando's Gatherings for Good. This is September 2021. I'm Dylan McCain Allen. I am a programs co-chair for the 2021 year on the board of directors, and I am joined by Sophie Granville. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I'm Sophie Granville, like Dylan mentioned. I am the development chair and the vice chair this year for YNPN Orlando. So excited to have this conversation and be here tonight. And hopefully you guys have some good questions and comments. So please don't hesitate. Throw them all at us. We want to see them. So.
Absolutely. So, this is a format that we really had hoped was going to be able to take place in person like our last month did, but in the spike of the Delta variant, and we actually decided to go ahead and continue the virtual aspect for now, but would continue to love your feedback and how this space can be advantageous to you. The purpose of the Gatherings for Good has, and if you remember back when we did Pints and Podcasts and the book club, it's a space that there's so much information out there to learn. And on top of changing the world, we have to simultaneously become experts at changing the world, not to mention technical experts in our own respective fields, and all for no resources to really do any of it. So that's really why YNPN Orlando came in, for this space to be one where we can connect with each other, where we can learn the things of like podcasts, read books, articles, bring the science down to our level, and just condense it into a meatier but more useful range rather than having to go spend like hours or days reading a big long thick book. So we're so happy to have you here today. And I'm so happy to introduce one of my very favorite podcast episodes from one of my most very favorite podcasts, and that is Joan Garry's Nonprofits Are Messy podcast. The episode is 114. Should we, what is it? What if fundraising de-emphasized the donor? Which is a super weird question, and is exactly why I got really interested in the topic, especially since it represents includes two folks that I love, especially one in particular you might know, Voulay, with the nonprofit AF blog. If you really like unicorns as much as I do, or possibly more, then he's a great one, because he's got like really angry unicorns with rainbow locks that are just bitching about how struggling the nonprofit sector can be. So if you want a good laugh to your inbox every week, definitely follow Nonprofit AF. Michelle Muri has been doing this work around equity for nonprofits and leadership development for years, a lot of advocacy and social justice, as well as challenging the way that nonprofits have been working. So I'm very excited to have their breath and my colleague Sophie here to reflect a little bit. This entire conversation, while we're going to have a few guided questions, we would love your input, and I'll be checking the chat regularly. So please feel free to chime in on Facebook or on YouTube, comment directly below, and it'll come up for me. And we'll be sure to address questions as they go through. And if not immediately, we will get to them towards the end. But for now, Sophie, I'd love to turn to you, and I'd love to ask, what were your initial reflections and thoughts to the episode, as well as to community-centric fundraising?
Sure. Well, first of all, I love Joan Garry. Anything that she says, bow down to the nonprofit queen. Absolutely.
Yes.
It's so refreshing to see someone from a generation older than ours, kind of taking a look at things in a new light. I don't know necessarily how old Joan Garry is. Young forever, but she's definitely older than us. And so it's interesting to kind of look at that and think about, a lot of the times these kind of perspectives typically come from the younger generation, which is exciting in many regards. But yes, that's interesting. So side note on Joan Garry. But I would say, to be perfectly honest with you, my initial reaction to this podcast was it kind of made me a little anxious. Maybe when there's something that's on the tip of your tongue that you're like, something's not quite right. And then when someone says it and, tweaks that sentence just a little bit, makes it sound just right, it clicks. That's almost what happened when I listened to this one. Just the title alone, what if fundraising decentralized? I mean, everything that I've ever learned about fundraising, everything I've ever been taught, all of my mentors, everyone in the fundraising field will tell you that is the opposite of what you want to do. In no situation do you ever want to make the donor feel like they're not the hero, they're not the main character of the story, which is such an interesting thing when you take a step back and look at it, really, because really donors aren't the main character in the story here. So it was interesting listening and kind of getting the different analogies from both Vu and Michelle, which Dylan, I know you mentioned a couple of them earlier. But it was just almost anxiety inducing. I don't know what you thought when you listened to it the first time.
I tend to take new ideas very critically, and my background is psychology, and in one thing in psychology with the science is there's a lot of pseudoscience out there. So a lot of my collegiate education was in picking out things that sound lofty and being able to figure out the deeper story within. And so I definitely went in with a very critical, though still optimistic mindset, because like you, I walked into this episode with them speaking. Well, I already loved the presenters going in, but to hear this in a frame where I've definitely, as a professional fundraiser and a grants professional, I do have struggles and challenges. And I am very oftentimes almost bewildered by the way that nonprofits have lived in this, as Vu describes it, the nonprofit Hunger Games. This scarcity model where we feel that we have to fight each other, and where we also have this, sometimes it's a supportive relationship with donors and sometimes it's combative, but either the way it can almost feel like reeling in cats just to make sure everything behind the curtain is going really well so that the actual mission in front of the curtain is performing to its best ability. So walking through this, I was like, there's no way that could happen. There's no way that could happen. There's no way that could happen. But until I really reflected after listening to the podcast and following up on some of the resources that were mentioned that we'll provide today in this event, it came to me to really think and build gravitas over this. So one of the points that Vu brought up was that really did shake me to my core, is I had conceptually understood that most donors are white. They look like me. And so when thinking, however, through when we build a donor-centric fundraising model off of those major donors that have historically held much of the wealth and resources in our society, we're not just building a white base, we're building whiteness into the fabric of our organization. So I wanted to talk to you, Sophie. What are some ways that you find that we as white fundraisers have kind of embedded whiteness into nonprofit missions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it definitely goes hand in hand. I mean, as a fundraising professional, as a leader of a development team that works towards, meeting goals and strategies for the year, I think that a lot of the time we do get caught up in that donor-centric model, which hand in hand, not that anyone ever really means for it to end up that way, but a lot of the times we do directly play into that continued whiteness model. And I think that as fundraisers specifically, and looking at how we personally embed those situations, those characteristics into our missions, I think it's by refusing to be uncomfortable. I think that as fundraisers, we've been told that there's a specific way we fundraise. We fundraise by focusing on the donor-centric model, and the donor-centric model directly benefits the white, oftentimes, businessman. And by refusing to take little opportunities to put ourselves in maybe a slightly uncomfortable position, which no one wants to be uncomfortable in what they're doing. The nonprofit sector is so unique in that directly in your line of work, every single day, you have the opportunity to make social change. That's definitely something that is, one, stress-inducing, and two, unique to this sector. So by no means is this something that changes and shifts overnight. But taking the opportunity to do small things. I was on a conference call with someone from AFP Canada, and AFP Canada does this wonderful thing where before every single presenter speaks, they take a moment and they thank the Indigenous populations that occupied the land in which their programs now call home. And of course, if I stopped a board meeting and right before I did my presentation on development, spoke about that. Sure, it might make my board, they might be like, what's going on? Hold up. But if I took those 2 minutes and I made myself a little bit uncomfortable by doing something just a little bit differently, I think that small changes like that can accumulate to making big changes. So I think that all in all, the thing that we do to continue to perpetuate that is by not making ourselves a little bit uncomfortable every now and again. I don't know what you think, Dylan.
Absolutely. So, I love that you bring up this point of being comfortable with the discomfort. And I think that's something that we in the nonprofit sector know much more acutely than I think other folks do when we deal with real heavy stuff day by day. It takes a really special, unique kind of person to handle things like a child losing a parent, or a whole family being food insecure, having a father or a mother who's been out of work for months and then struggling bit by bit ever in between. There's a lot of heavy conversations that we have, and we've built a great deal of comfort in the discomfort in that regard. I think something that is unique to me is how often I've seen, as much as we are here to make change, there's this kind of, I almost feel like there's this traumatic event that happens in every nonprofit professional's life that makes them go from like, we need to change everything, to like, change is hard, it's slow, and I'm going to not make it that way, but I'm going to assume that it has to be slow and steady. So I'm going to inch the change within myself, to inch the change within the organization, to inch the change elsewhere. And I think that there's a degree of pushback that has to be put on that. I think that we have to realize that while some things are going to be complex, while as much as I would love to snap our fingers and in 5 years climate change no longer be a factor, that is going to be a long-term change. But in some things, and when we look at things like ending systemic racism, while it's a long term, it's been a long time. And when we continue to look at it and push at it like, well, could be a decades long, then it becomes a centuries long thing. And so we do need to take not just the power and the agency, but the responsibility to make those changes. Some things that I've seen in particular, so in addition to my work with YNPN Orlando, I'm on another board called CRAVE, which is a social innovation accelerator, and we have a large number of folks who are of color. I recently started nonprofits, we're about to start nonprofits. Some of them are also doing social entrepreneurships. And, I had one of the folks in that network tell me just a couple weeks ago, she's a Black woman who's attempting to pull together resources for a more systemic approach towards mental health in low-income communities, but she's pretty targeting on Black and brown communities. When she approached a funder for a multi-million-dollar grant, they loved the project. They loved the idea. They trusted her capacity, even as a new organization, to be able to carry out a multi-year grant that really would have made a massive difference in the organization, the mission, and the community. But the one reason they said they wouldn't give it to her is because she didn't have any partners. And she responded, there's no one else doing this work. That's why I founded this. I am someone who grew up in these communities, and I didn't have the resources, and they still don't exist. But that is, to me, something that, as for whiteness, that from a funder perspective, I can understand they're trying to build systemic change, but remember that like sometimes the grassroots change is where it starts. And from a grants professional standpoint, we continue to allow that. We perpetuate that because we have not been comfortable enough to tell our donors and our funders when something's challenging for us. We have grown and been traumatized with the expectation that if we give feedback to our donors, they will leave. And that's just not the case. I've done a lot of work with dozens, if not over 100 funders, not even from a fundraising standpoint. And consistently, they tell me they wish their fundees, their grantees, would speak with them more. Tell them when the projects didn't go well. Tell them when they needed additional support. Tell them when an application was too cumbersome. There's going to be some things that they don't have the power out of, but some things they really do want to be here for us. They see themselves as the resource generator to what is the best machine, and that's the nonprofit sector.
Absolutely. I mean, Michelle in the podcast episode mentions briefly this idea of a constellation, and how each of us is kind of a star or a place in this constellation, and understanding who you are and where you are in that constellation, and how that kind of maps across the sky and creates opportunities and doesn't create opportunities in cases, is interesting, and definitely something that fits in well. But absolutely, I agree.
There's so much to talk about too, and Voulet really does go into a lot of the very specific pieces in his Nonprofit AF blog, and what Michelle Muri will be talking about in her Ethical Rainmaker podcast. There's so much more to learn and discuss on this. And for anybody who's interested more in talking about how whiteness has really been embedding itself into nonprofits, I encourage you to go look back at YNPN Orlando's Facebook or YouTube pages, and you'll see we recently did a panel with some excellent experts in the community, and that was Actualizing Antiracism, a really phenomenal thing. I really recommend all viewers here to go check that out. It'll be also give great context for this conversation. So the next question that I have for you, Sophie, is, one of the other points of this was bringing these conversations back into the organization. So how do we even start the conversation with donors? Something that I recall from the podcast was Joan Garry at some point getting sympathetic and empathetic to the viewers who are just trying to get $1,000 from this donor. They finally tracked down, were able to get on the calendar after like 3 months of trying to get a virtual coffee meeting. And now we're supposed to examine their wealth and like where the money came from and like really challenge them to think more broadly about their philanthropy. Like, how do we bring these conversations to an already overtaxed, overburdened, over-responsibilityed, whatever that word would be, I'm going to create a new one here, nonprofit board members and executive leaders? How do we bring this conversation to the team?
Ooh, I don't know that there's a complete answer to that one. That's absolutely a tricky one. But I will say that for me personally, with a development team, with an organization that's just turned 20 years old, shout out to the Conductive Education Center here in Orlando. Woo! It's interesting to think about, especially as a young development professional, how important it is for older generations who are now still operating within this development space to understand that at a certain point, corporate social responsibility, there it is, CSR, the idea that at any given point, at any given time, anyone has access to any of the information that they want within 2 seconds flat on their cell phone in front of them. At a certain point, I think it becomes a business practice. If you as a nonprofit are steward.
I don't know if you lost me or if we lost Sophie.
I'm back.
Okay, great. Awesome.
We were both gone. We're back.
Great.
It's because we talked about social media. They heard us.
All right, Zucky Zucks.
Yeah. But like I was saying, at a certain point, it becomes a business practice. Like these massive corporations who are now having people look into their financials and who they're giving money to and who they're supporting and where that money is coming from. At a certain point, as a nonprofit who has been designed at the very core of the theory of nonprofits to fulfill this gap in society that to serve a population that really needs you, at a certain point, if you're not acknowledging and learning to take a deeper look at revenue, where it's coming from, why it's coming from, who it's coming from, I think eventually that will catch up to you. And I think that a lot of our boards, a lot of our individuals who help steward our organizations to success are business-oriented people. And when it comes down to that, that's a transactional statement. If you aren't acknowledging corporate social responsibility, even if you're a small nonprofit, at a certain point, if you ever intend on growing, I mean, look at organizations like Goodwill, look at when they get looked into, where their funding comes from, places like that. I mean, it's at a certain point, I think it becomes crucial for your nonprofit to even survive. And as a development professional, especially if you're leading a team or you're just starting out on a team, even, I think that it comes down to it again, that little moment where you're uncomfortable, that little moment where we had a really great conversation at our last Gatherings for Good about elevating the voices of the populations around us. And I think that comes into play here as well. As a manager, as a leader in this industry, are you taking a couple of minutes of silence to really just sit and allow for an individual who might be softer spoken, who might not feel like they can speak up? Are you giving them time and space to breathe, to speak? Is there some way they can get a hold of you, to contact you, to question something that you're doing? My staff knows that I hate the phrase, "we've always done it this way." I will never, ever just say, "we've always done it this way, this is what we'll do." It drives me absolutely crazy.
Oh, me too. Oh, so, man.
How do you create that channel of communication, though? And I think that comes down to knowing your staff, knowing what works best for you personally. But just take a minute and think about, if someone did want to discuss with you these issues, someone did want to bring to the table, hey, I don't necessarily know that our board is very diverse. Have you looked at that recently? How would they get that to you? And think about the quietest person in the room, not the loudest. Because I'd have no problem, but somebody else might. So I think that there's a lot of small strategies that add up to the larger, bigger picture. And you sent out a really great resource, that community-centric fundraising checklist that helps us it's a good starting point to begin to evaluate programs, to begin to evaluate development, the board, and everything in between. It, of course, can be a little bit overwhelming to look at the list and see all of the things that might need to change for your organization. But that's a good thing, because that means, if you're not a little bit uncomfortable, you're not growing, right?
Absolutely.
So
I love that. Well, first, before I make this point, I just want to note that there is something that YNPN Orlando's board has found, and I can't remember it right now, but it's an amazing tool. It's a timer that I think it's like something that if you don't have a pair of ovaries and your skin is not highly melanated, how much of the meeting are you taking up of? And it's literally a time, like someone who's not a woman, who's white, how long are they speaking versus everyone else? And if they're taking up more than like 70% of the conversation, you need to go, it's time for someone else to talk. And I recognize, like, I'm a white man, I'm charismatic. I grew up in a household. I'm an Eagle Scout. I was raised to speak and project with my shoulders back, with my chest pumped up, to speak directly and speak plainly, and I carry presence. That's a wide range of privileges that brought me to that point, and I have to be mindful that while I do know a lot, I read books all the time, I learn a lot, I consider myself a smart person, but that in never any teeny tiny way means I know everything. In the slightest. I don't even know like 2% of everything, no matter how much I'll ever learn. So finding moments to shut up is something that we fundraisers, it's a skill. This is out of donor-centric fundraising, not even community-centric. We need to be pretty good at being quiet. It's the same reason that when we go and talk to donors and we ask for advice, there's that old adage of those who ask for money get advice, those who ask for advice get money. That old kind of adage that we really do have to train our listening ear to figure out what it is that they're wanting to do with their pot of funds. And by the way, Vu actually has a very particular point on that I encourage you to listen to the podcast and learn more about. Another point, though, that really stuck with me from what you mentioned is I love this change management along with upward management. managing up. So oftentimes when you get you go get your MBA or you go take a webinar on management, oftentimes you're managing down, but we so seldomly learn about how to talk with a supervisor, how to ask for a raise, how to have a grievance about an organizational policy, how to even just really ask for elaboration over a policy. We're not trained on how to navigate the hierarchies in our organizations. And much of the hierarchy in our organizations, I recently learned this, a lot of the hierarchies that we have from like upper management, middle management, lower management, and then in our sector, we call it coordinator level. This is built from the industrial age, where the entire purpose was we were all building the same exact widget, and we just needed to do it as quickly and efficiently as possible. And that's not the case in our work. We do not have, in no nonprofit have I ever heard of, do they ever have 2 days that are the same, 2 clients that are the same, 2 donors that are the same. And having this strict hierarchy isn't exactly as supportive to the managerial styles and operations of our organizations as we might think. So I think on that lens, we do have to both, from a higher standpoint, break down the barriers. From a lower standpoint on the totem pole, think about this whole hierarchy of going to go talk to my president is really not necessary, because I'm on the ground. I know a lot of things that my president will never know, just as there's things that she knows that I will never know. I am learning a lot about change management. And the final point that I can add into this is something that I'm a very rational person. I think if a change needs to happen, well, it just needs to happen. There's a new technology. We're getting onboarded. Get settled. And I have to understand that there's a lot of emotions that come along with that change, like you mentioned. And these are how we've done things. They built an efficient system, so they don't have to think about it. They don't have to worry about it, whether it be inputting a donor name or how they meet with donors. That's a skill that has been flexed for years, if not decades. And so it can be scary, and it really can actually activate the sympathetic system, the fight or flight system. And so I think for me, that was a big learning moment, that I have to have a lot of compassion, as well as self-compassion, that I want something to happen, and compassion for others that they may want the change, they just don't know how to embrace it in the way that I do.
Absolutely. I would throw one more step onto that almost, because I think deep down, all of the stewards who our board of directors are individuals who are responsible for the compliance and the stewarding of the organization, really holding it up on their hands to make sure that for generations it's still around. I think that deep down they understand and feel and rationalize with that change has to happen. But beyond that, I think that if you're in an organization, a situation, a standpoint where it's uncomfortable to think about change in that almost progressive lens of thought, when it comes to societal outlook and things of that nature, I think that another important point here is, as a funder, my direct supervisors, my board of directors, they speak dollars and cents. And quite frankly, looking at this model and looking at the ways that nonprofits can expand and develop a better community and move away from this nonprofit Hunger Games that you speak of, it increases the pool of revenue. It's not just additional work that we're doing to create this social change, which, yes, is a wonderful, powerful, a moving thing. There's also this very real possibility that pooling all of the revenue and creating this community-centric model means that our organizations will have more support, more diversified support, more meaningful support, and support that can actually continue to further our organization's missions. So if you're looking at resources and ways that you can have that conversation, remember that there's a very real dollars and cents number behind that. Vu does this in the beginning of the podcast, which I encourage you to go back and listen to. He speaks about the pond with the ducks, and how there's bread involved, and that some in the donor-centric model, donors believe that they are a different kind of duck that isn't part of community of ducks in this pond. But ultimately, if we all improve the pond and make the pond a better place to live together, more bread comes to the pond, more people come to the pond. He says it in much prettier words, but it comes down to increased revenue for all, which can never be a bad thing when it comes to such important missions that all of us work to serve. So
just a donor. He even said that he had a donor that wanted to learn of another organization that was going to be different. And he was concerned that he was about to literally give a donor somewhere else. But he anyway introduced that donor to another executive director. And in fact, the donor came back and gave to both organizations. Now the other executive director brings their donors to Vu's organization that he formerly was with. And another little note that came up was, and by the way, this conversation about the abundance mindset as opposed to scarcity mindset being the nonprofit Hunger Games, Stanford Social Innovation Review is quite clear in this, that there truly generally is enough resources out there for every organization to go out and do their work. It's just rather a misalignment of how we perceive of those resources. Mm-hmm. And I think, one thing that's interesting to me is I have brought up community-centric fundraising to other people, and I ask, what are your thoughts on this? Not even just trying to tell an opinion or tell them about it, but I'm just curious if they heard what they think. And then initial thought that I almost consistently get from folks is, well, Dylan, we've been talking about pulling people of color into philanthropy for years. This is nothing new, which is a component, but one really tiny piece of this broader movement that is really trying to shift a lot of base assumptions in fundraising, and not just fundraising, but understand the general resource engine that drives change making. And so one of the other points of the podcast was, how can we get donors to examine their wealth? This was, I think, the real meat and potatoes of what the community-centric fundraising movement it wants to get at. And I mentioned this in the primer video, but for those folks who haven't seen it, I think it's really important to think of these two examples from an unexamined wealth standpoint. There was a philanthropist who passed away did not yet pass away. They were filling out a bequest. So they were writing out their will for when they do eventually pass away. Billionaire, made money off of a chemical company that creates birth defects and has killed living people and also degraded entire, not just communities, but ecosystems. So literally money was made from blood money, from the deaths of both humans as well as ecosystems. But still believed that they wanted to give 75% of their wealth to their children, and did believe in giving back, so wanted to give 25% of their wealth to their community and to the world. And that was a moment where, in Michelle Muri's opinion, that's made off of blood money. That's not your money. You stole that money from people, and it is rightfully deserved back to the people who have had their lives appended and their communities appended based off that money that you built. Maybe not entirely all of it, but a big chunk of it is owed back, and that's justice. That's unexamined wealth. Come examined wealth. This other story that was brought up of how a foundation in the country, national foundation, had recognized that their wealth that they had been redistributing out through grants was amassed through the railroad industry, which, mind you, had stolen land from indigenous populations, not to mention committed genocide against those same populations to be able to steal the land, and had brought in forced slave labor from Asian immigrants. And so recognizing that wealth that was being shadowed and veiled as this amazing, here we are saving the world, while at the same time, this has caused a lot of the problems that we supposed to save the world from, that savior mentality. And they finally recognized that and now give at least 60% of their grants go towards the same Indigenous communities that had been harmed in the building of those railroad systems. That's examined well. So a lot of times we think that like donors they can't really learn, they can't think, they can't grow. And another point too was, another story related to this was I'm blanking because there's so many different ones, but basically there's so many different, before I get into the story, I'll shut up and let Sophie kind of respond here. But I guess my point is there's a lot to think about in where the money comes from and how to get involved and how to get donors involved into the mission. I think that something that donors would be pleasantly surprised by is us to stop infantilizing them. And Vu makes that point directly in the podcast. We really do treat donors like they don't know anything, they can't know anything, this is way above their pay grade. And I really think that we should challenge that. I think that letting them know the roots of this problem, letting them know how it came to be, letting them know that we are only at this point going to make incremental change because there's a broader view. I think donors would like to know what's going on so that they can generatively know about and make a difference. So in that point, Sophie, what are your thoughts? I know I said a lot there.
No.
As far as engaging donors and challenging them to examine their wealth and philanthropy, how might we go about that?
Whew.
But meat and potatoes, hey.
This one, I'll tell you, this is a challenging question. Absolutely. I would argue it's one of the more important questions, topic wise. But I had to take a step back on this one, looking at my own organization, looking at organizations I've worked with in the past. When Vu speaks in the podcast about mailing out a book on evaluating your own wealth and things of that nature, I mean, I, at this current point, couldn't imagine doing something like that. But in my head, I'm strategizing and thinking, how could we do this better? How can we always do things better? And I think that I don't have the answer by any means as to how exactly we can challenge our donors to examine their wealth directly. I don't think it's sending out a checklist saying, did your money come from this? I think there are absolutely ways.
So you owe us $20.
Yeah. Please connect here if you, yeah.
Wow, imagine. Oh, don't do that. That is not a recommendation.
Yes, YNPN does not endorse that.
Not that particular one,
I mean, I think that, so as a fundraiser, one of my favorite parts about my job is the relationships that I get to build. Yeah. The conversations that I get to have with donors, the conversations that I get to have with individuals in the community who want to be a part of the program somehow, who want to see the program in action, who want to feel what the program does for children and adults, and know that here in their community, there's something that's helping a population that needs to be helped. Yeah. So those relationships, I think, it's interesting because it's almost a paradigm, because we say we want to move away from the donor-centric model where we, keep our donor on this pedestal. We focus on only cultivating our relationship with them and making sure that at all times they feel comfortable. But also we want to create real relationships.
Absolutely.
Real input, real output, where they feel like they're a living, breathing part of the program, because they are. The example that Vu, or might have been Michelle, uses in this one that struck a chord for me was the donors who come into programs wearing suits.
Yeah.
As someone who wears a suit every day, I can see how this would be by accident almost. I can see how this would be something that I wouldn't think about. If someone said to me, if you said to me, Dylan, come out, visit my program, we're doing this, this, and this, chances are that day I would be in a suit. But I would want you as a donor, in this case, if I were supporting your program, I would fundamentally want you to tell me hey, you're going to be a little bit out of place wearing this suit. Just like I would want you to tell me if your child's Sweet 16 was formal long ball gowns at the Met.
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that while dress code is kind of a trivial thing, it's something that, you know, is easy to digest. I think that that's the layer right there. That's the boundary. That's the line we have to dance. And this doesn't just extend to individual giving, to major gifts or endowments, things like that, where it's just one donor making a contribution. I think this extends even further than that to grant-making organizations, to foundations who are deeply rooted in these huge histories of families who have always had money and have always invested in community and have always felt this purpose to serve community, but have never really taken a look and thought about what that means and where their money might have come from. And that's not going to be an easy conversation for anyone to have by any means.
Much less with oneself.
Yeah, much less with one's exactly. I mean, think about these foundations that have been around for hundreds of years, pumping. I mean, think about, it's a silly comparison, but think about your Uncle Ben's rice and your Aunt Jemima, things like that, where the conversations that sparked, again, that corporate social responsibility, where we as a consumer said, hey, you know what? I don't think that it's right that on the Land O'Lakes butter, you're portraying Indigenous populations this way.
Yeah.
I mean, as nonprofits and as leaders of thought and social change, I think that if we're not holding ourselves and other organizations accountable, we're not even close to being able to say that we are the social change that will make this work, if that makes sense. It's an interesting one for sure. And I think that the most important piece and part of fundraising and donor-centric relations specifically is the individual. And I think that this looks different for every donor. I think this looks a little uncomfortable for everyone. But how uncomfortable depends, I think, on the donor. And please feel free to disagree with me there. But
I totally. I mean, think about how, and something that Vu brings up is that like different communities like to be thanked in different ways. And when we think, when we look at, doing handwritten thank you cards, for example, that he brings up specifically, that works in a white American endpoint. But in Vietnamese culture, they don't really care about gift cards. They care about food. And I know a lot of other cultures are that way as well. And that's how they take gratitude. That's how they express gratitude. And that's also how you can build community. And so thinking through in like the community that here we are. So when we sit here in Orlando, we have to think about the fact that we have communities of Puerto Ricans and Brasilianos, and we've got Colombianos, and we have the Haitians, and we have Vietnamese and Korean, and we've just got such a massively diverse community, and to treat folks like
that we're lucky to have. We're lucky, absolutely lucky to come from that perspective.
Yeah, sure. and to understand and to think through the way that, like, to thank someone, for me as a white fundraiser, to thank someone how I would want to be thanked is unintentionally a little bit egotistical. It elevates myself more than it does picking up the phone and asking someone, how do you like to be thanked? Mm-hmm. And for some ways, like, rather than having this big Swayze exclusive donor happy hour, like some folks I talk to, even the rich white folk, are like, this is an awkward model.
It happens absolutely all the time. There are people who don't want to wear suits.
They don't like want to come to that. Want to dress up and get all gussied up for the night, but a lot of times they're tired for the day. They want to have a drink, maybe, and not even in all cases. Sometimes they don't even want to be around people. They just flip in love with the mission, and they just want to be enamored in it. Some of them, like y'all, do you know how DPOC, the Dr. Phillips Performing Arts Center, has like those the big long. They're like cubicles to sit in now that are outdoors.
Yeah, the front yard festival.
Introvert. I'm so excited. I feel like I can go to a play or to a musical or to like a performance and just sit in my own little thing, like get on the phone app, have them bring me my drink. I don't have to talk to you. Yes, my best friend is 2 cubicles over. I want nothing to do with them. I'm tired. I am not in an extroverted moment at this point. I just want to appreciate what's on the damn screen. And having those moments, that can work for some folks. So I think that a lot of this doesn't have to look like, all right, we're going to have a whole conversation about racism and think about all the deep, dark areas that has pulled down to. Because I think also we have to remember to celebrate the joy. Like, Black life is joy. Like, there's so much to appreciate and support about it. Like, talking about issues of equity doesn't always have to. While it does need to be mindful, I think that we can think and celebrate that. Like, have you just had Jamaican food lately? Like, let's just go. If you not, let's go enjoy some of it, because there's some. It's way more than just jerk seasoning.
And take it a step further. When you look at strategies that do teach donors to examine their own wealth in situations where it is successful, where we do see the implementation, in the situations like what Michelle and Vu talked about, where these groups are now recognizing that a portion of their grant making, their investment back into community should go to these groups. Make that a point of inspiration.
Yeah.
For the other donors, the other groups, the other foundations. I mean, how often do you see press that says, other than when it's a bad thing?
Yeah.
I mean, think about what would it do for a donor? I mean, if I saw someone every now and again, trivial again, but someone says, look at this great perk to being vegan. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's wonderful. You know, like, I'm inspired to feel like I'm part of a movement that's also assisting and bettering the community that I'm a part of. And I think that those individual relationships and keeping people happy as much as you can, of course, again, always going to be uncomfortable for a split second.
And there's going to be people uncomfortable, like, and they leave. And that
let's
can
be uncomfortable. Let's be uncomfortable. Take their meal home in a box.
Yeah.
Don't do that during COVID. But you know, I think that, and Vu does talk about someone, a donor that he spoke with that did end up leaving an organization. And yes, that is a fundraiser's worst nightmare. Someone saying, do not call me, do not email me, do not contact, is a fundraiser's worst nightmare. But think about the nightmare that will come from the article that says nonprofit accepts donation from foundation rooted in, you know, destruction of indigenous populations' land.
Yeah.
I mean,
last week, my executive director sent me a foundation. They're like, oh, I just heard about this one. You know, they seem like we'd be able to get a donation from them. I'm like, oh, cool. Let me look into them. So I looked into it and found that most recent article I can find on them is that they've given millions to anti-LGBT organizations.
Yes.
Sorry, will not be applying. And those are the kind of things that I think that this is an actionable point for us to take into our missions. This is, I think, the meat and potatoes of what it is that here we are trying to do. And we do have to think of how equity and efficacy align extremely well. I think when we think through what are the barriers, and this goes back to whiteness, there's a lot of pieces in whiteness, especially in foundation requirements and corporate requirements, that really hold nonprofits from being able to do the actual change that has to happen. If we are an organization that, like, realistically is not going to make a difference without policy, but all of your donors, all of your funders, all require that you do not engage in lobbying or advocacy, what are you doing as an organization? Why are you here? Are you just a clearinghouse for their checks? Like, what are you here for? So I think those are the times, too, that we have to sit back and be grateful of that bless and release mentality. And possibly even, I don't want to say be grateful for, understand, like, from an executive perspective, they have to be the person to fire a staff, to let them go, to lay someone off. I understand that, how hard that is. But that's where this abundance mindset of working together with organizations does play in together, and why we at YNPN Orlando have these conversations, because there is a perception that if we lose a donor, all is lost. And that's not the case. It really truly can be a benefit in certain circumstances. And even in those that it's not, there are so many great ways to be able to build the resources you need for your mission without having to grovel, without having to sacrifice the mission. And if that's something that you were willing to prioritize a donor's individual desires over what your community needs, that alone is the purpose of this podcast and the purpose of this meeting here today. Because Vu and Michelle are super transparent. This is new. Y'all, community-centric fundraising existed as like an official formal model with the lexicon to use this verbiage in the way that we do for a year. It's existed for a year. They just celebrated their 1-year anniversary like 2 weeks ago. There's going to be, yeah, right? Like there's going to be ways that we fail. We're going to be wrong. This is going to be a learning process, but never before has there been a venue for us fundraisers that have all collectively understood that this thing that we excel at could be done better. This is a model for us to at least build not just comprehension, but conversation and reflection. And from the reflection, the real key point is the action. And so, Sophie, for my final question for you of the night, what are some immediate takeaways that you walked away with for your work?
Many.
Excellent.
Where to start? No, I'm just kidding. Tune in next week for my full notes.
It's like I do entire thesis on it. It's section 72 for
I'd like to cite minute notes. I think that
APA, MLA, or Chicago.
Yeah, APA. I think that the most important takeaway from this conversation, which is an ongoing one, by all means, like you mentioned, it's a young model for fundraising. Fundraising itself, even though we have existing models, continues to evolve. I evolve the way I have conversations and the way I send emails, the way I communicate with donors, the way I collect checks, even every single day. Because so often something that the older generation of fundraising continues to instill is this idea that we've always done it that way. So if this is your wake-up call for that, then I want you to know that you don't always have to do it that way. That as a development professional, as a volunteer at an organization, as a donor who gives $5 a month or $1 to the Red Cross at Walgreens when they ask you if you want to round up, you have an important role to play in the accountability for this. And if you understand where you are and where your unique position in this community, in this society as a whole, where your unique position comes into play, then I think you'll better understand how your position can make the small changes that are needed for us to evolve this thing we called fundraising. I think that a big takeaway for me was that it's okay that this is overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's okay that looking at this is something completely different than what you've ever known. It's okay that there are so many parts and pieces at this that you have to pick away at it just a little bit every day or every couple of days to really truly understand it. I think that it starts, like many things, like many change with that, or many change, like all change, with that little degree of uncomfortability and a self-evaluation. Take a moment, think about where you are in the puzzle, print off this checklist from the Community-Centric fundraising website. Print it off. Just take 2 seconds and go through and think about, is there something small that I could do for each of these that might take me a minute a day, that might really make a huge difference? What can I do that makes me just a little bit uncomfortable, but could really have a huge impact? And start there. Start with the things that make you comfortable. Start with the little, the things that clearly add up to additional dollars and cents. Start with the things that help deepen your relationships with donors. Start with the pieces of the puzzle that you like. If you don't like interacting with donors in that way, don't start there. Because at the end of the day, there's no one else out there that's going to drive this movement forward, that's going to be at the center of this, than this next generation of professionals that's coming up in this sector. And that's you. So if that's you. No pressure. No pressure. Like I said,
we're entrusting saving the world to you.
Yeah. It's not like you don't already feel that pressure. So take that pressure, turn it into something that inspires you and that inspires the donors around you, that inspires your community, and ultimately serves the mission that you're trying to serve. I mean, all of us are in this industry for a reason. Yeah. It's definitely not the pay.
Not the pay.
So
what, you don't have a 3-to-1 401k contribution from your nonprofit? What?
What's a 401k? So I mean, really, ultimately, know who you are, know what you're capable of doing, and have the courage to be just uncomfortable for just a minute, and really do your research. If you're a research person like I am, find the dollars and cents that make sense to you, and the pieces that you can incorporate on your side of what you do, because it's going to take a lot of small steps until we get there. But don't stop the conversation is the big part.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Those are excellent thoughts. Some of the thoughts that I've pulled away from, I love that the concept that Michelle brought up of valuing time as much as money, and valuing the $5 donor as much as the $50,000 donor. And that's a really hard thing to think about, especially for fundraisers. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to call up the $5 donor every 6 months to check in and see how they're doing necessarily. But I think that they deserve an invite to the event as much as anyone else. We had a campaign at a Gift for Teaching where I work a few months ago, and we had someone who just gave $10, but I had the time to call not just the major donors, but every donor into that campaign. And he was really appreciative. He's like, I would have never thought I've never been called to get a thank you for my gift. I'm going to give $10 every month now. And that 10, first of all, from a dollar standpoint, grew, and it became recurrent, regular income that we can depend on. For folks to think about also in community standpoint, I love this idea of community participatory grant making and community participatory budgeting. So the difference, they're very similar, but the difference is we pull folks together that are affected by the issue. So at a Gift for Teaching, for example, it could be a group of families that don't have the funds or to prioritize at least school supplies. And so how can we pull those folks together and ask them, is this model what's best for you? Is that what's going to be most generative in supporting your children and their education in this moment? It's what teachers have told us, but is it what you as a family need? And if so, or if not, give us feedback. And so with the community participatory budgeting, it's actually having a pot of funds for those folks to say, this is what we need. Here's a decision that we're collectively going to make on this pot of funds for our needs, as opposed to the community participatory granting, which is where participatory grant making is where the same group, this is what we need, we're going to grant it out to have this happen. Both of them, either way, is pulling the community to have a candid conversation. This is what we need from our community with the community's resources, as opposed to us in our privileged ivory towers of the nonprofit C-suite imposing that. So at the end of the day, community-centric fundraising is not turning away donors. It's not saying that we value ideals over a pocketbook, frankly, to be blunt, because we have to still pay for the people to be here. It is just encouraging us as fundraisers and nonprofit professionals to rethink relationships, to still show gratitude and gratefulness to be a part of this mission in a way that's generative, that's efficacious, that's equitable, that is authentic to our missions. Well, that's all that we have. I don't see any comments. Any questions are welcome to come in. Sophie, I want to thank you so much for your time and joining me today. This has been a really excellent dialogue. I'm really happy and thankful to you, the viewers, for just coming in and making sure to keep this movement and everything that you do day by day. One thing that we're always very adamant about and is very important as based off the research when it comes to doing anti-racist work is to take care of yourself, because this is a long, hard work here. So I want to thank you all so much for this time. Highly encourage that you do go watch and listen to the podcast. I believe that the link that is included, and go if you look it up online, I believe there's actually a transcript if you prefer to read it instead. Also, some other ways to kind of take this forward is to learn more at community-centric.fundraising.org. Like Sophie mentioned, there's a really great resource there called the CCF Aligned Actions List. If you go into the resources tab of community-centric.fundraising.org, you'll get a really good, like, the takeaways of some things to either immediately embed into your organization or build upon. And then secondly, if you're really interested in this conversation to continue to bring from concept into true meaning, the Ethical Rainmaker podcast is dedicated towards not just teaching, but really learning about this whole community-centric fundraising movement. So please do look into these. We're so happy that you all joined us. And to let you all know that on October 14th, there's going to be a mentor moment. So be sure to keep that on your calendars. It's going to be in the evening. We're really excited for that one. The last one did great. We just love having these excellent nonprofit leaders come and share their story. Please feel free to join us then. And as always, Gatherings for Good are every last Tuesday from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. The next one is still scheduled to be online. And if you have any resources that you'd like to look at too, our next October through December is going to be focused on holistic wellness. We are going to have a deep dive panel for you all that we're currently amassing. We're really excited about. If you like the panel for Actualizing Antiracism, it'll be great. It's going to be another panel that'll be online. So keep it in tune for that. That'll be posted on Facebook, and it will probably be live both on Facebook and YouTube. But otherwise, we're really happy to have you all here. Really happy that everything that you do, we respect you. We trust you with this work, which is so incredibly difficult, and you're so respected for it. Thanks. We love you. Have a great night, everyone. And thanks once again, Sophie.
Of course.